depression while they are having this addiction. You have to also manage the depression, because maybe the depression is fueling their use of the substance, right? What if the person is homeless? You know, even if you give the person treatment, if they don't have a place to live, that can make things very complicated for them. You know, do they have access to, you know, a job or something like that? You know, how are they in relation to their culture, in relation to their faith-based communities? Are they being incorporated into their communities, or people are shunning them? Are they being ostracized from their communities? All of those things have to be taken into consideration when you're treating somebody, regardless of the condition, but especially with something like this. Because if people do not have all of these things taken into consideration, it's more difficult to really provide a comprehensive, outcome, positive outcome for those people. So the idea is we want to promote what we call a biopsychosocial approach. So you take into account, first of all, making sure they have access to treatment. You know, in the case of opioids, you know, we have things like methadone. There's also a medication called buprenorphine that is used to help patients in terms of reducing their withdrawal symptoms and cravings, and also help with what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. So that would be something such as going to a 12-step program, going to Narcotics Anonymous, you know, some kind of support group so they can actually talk about what they're going through and know that they're not the only one going through it. That way that they have that support so they can, you know, continue with their treatment. With the psycho part, anything to do with addressing underlying psychiatric issues, whether it be depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, because sometimes those very things were the reason why the person ended up using the opioids in the first place. And also social things such as being reintroduced to their family, having that family support, being reintroduced to their community, kind of reestablishing those ties, because that can help reinforce all of the other efforts in terms of making sure they get attached to treatment. And so from the rhetorical perspective, going back to the idea of using rhetoric with action and outcomes, you want to look at it like a disease that requires a multidisciplinary team. So this is going to include very healthcare providers, social workers who are also healthcare providers, you know, anybody who's involved with housing, you know, jobs, putting all those people together to kind of work as a team to make sure these people get all the help that they need so they can get reintroduced to society. So also using the rhetoric that presents addiction as disease rather than as a moral failing to the general public. So this could be done through public service announcements, you know, when you see those things on TV, where they try to help, you know, they, for example, don't use cigarettes because they're bad, things like that. So public public service announcements are very helpful in that respect. You know, reaching out to the youth in school, having celebrities come out and say that something happened, because people often look up to celebrities. So if a celebrity can say, hey, you know, I had an addiction and I overcame it, that might help inspire somebody to seek out help, right? Faith-based communities, once again, because a lot of people, especially on the continent, are really tied to their religion of choice. So a lot of people relate their moral underpinnings to their religion of choice. So faith-based communities can really help people in terms of shaping their morals and understandings about how to go about interacting with people in a correct way. So that can help in terms of bridging the gap between people who are, you know, having the addiction and trying to find their way back into the society, and people who want to kind of take them in, but they don't really know how to go about it. And then the government can also help facilitate all of these things. So once again, going back to the previous point, addiction, we should consider it a disease rather than a moral failing. And if that happens, if people have the idea that it's a disease, their approach will be more towards providing treatment, increasing the resources available for treatment, and then helping to reintroduce people to society. So in terms of policy recommendations, the whole idea is we want to use all of that rhetoric that we talked about to address the stigma, and by way of using education and information. And we want to decentralize the delivery of care. So basically not just having it in one huge hospital in the middle of the country, but try to find ways to use community resources to help people get access to services. Because if it's decentralized, there's more likely a chance that the person will be able to have access to care that is tuned to whatever their cultural and other needs are. And then you want to have a national policy that incorporates what we call a patient-centered medical home. So this is basically, it's not like an actual home per se, but it's think of it like a construct where all of your healthcare providers are focused on you as the patient, and everything that they're doing is they're working as a team to make sure that they provide you as the patient with everything that you need. And then you want to apply technology. A lot of people on the continent have cell phones. So we want to use things that are already readily available to help with information dissemination. For example, they can send text messages to people with information on if they need access to addiction services, they can contact such and such number. We can also have a promotion of research and data collection to ensure that the policy are actually working. You don't want to try all these things and then have no clue if they're actually effective. So that's something you want to make sure you do. Our research is centered around using genomics to help with treatment outcomes. And we have seen, at least with the population of patients that we've seen in America, that we're using buprenorphine for their medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction, that genetics did actually impact their outcomes. And a lot of the patients needed a higher dose than the FDA recommended dose just to maintain the reduction of their withdrawal symptoms. So if we see that happening in an African diasporic population, we can only imagine what would be happening on the continent itself. So that's it. Thank you.
So, do you give her a passing grade?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so then we will allow her to move on to the next set of modules in her PhD program.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have the next speaker who will take the stage, sir. Please don't be bashful, come on up. Don't be lucky and coward.
Okay, very good. Hello, how are you? Are we doing okay? Very good. Our next speaker is actually Dr. Elizabeth Patterson. Our presentation is Decolonizing Disease, the 2014 Ebola epidemic, and warnings against bushmeat.
Oh, sorry. I'm not about that, but soon, a couple of weeks I will. So I appreciate the foreshadowing and the vote of confidence in my successful passing of my dissertation defense that I'm sure will happen in a couple of weeks. Okay. Thank you. So I'm a PhD candidate at George Mason, and this is a chapter of my dissertation. The title of my dissertation is Decolonizing Epidemics. And this particular chapter is about the bushmeat warnings. And the entire dissertation is about the 2014 Ebola epidemic. If you take the basic understanding of decolonization that was relayed to us this morning as deconstructing what we've become to understand as natural, then that is my argument in my dissertation, that epidemics are not natural, they're constructed, and one chapter is about the definition of epidemics, how they're defined. Another chapter is who gets to name an epidemic, who gets to turn a pathogen or an event into an epidemic. And then this chapter is about describing an epidemic or the narrative of an epidemic and how that narrative then constructs care. In June 2014, Vice News went to Liberia and published a piece called Monkey Meat and the Ebola Outbreak. The reporter traveled to Monrovia to investigate the Ebola outbreak alongside traditional practices of eating forest-dwelling animals, or bushmeat. The reporter interviewed several people while they were eating monkey, bat, and antelope meat. Kaj Larson, who is the vice reporter in this piece, went to one of the markets where he could easily buy bushmeat. He specifically asked around until he found a woman who was selling monkey meat. He purchased a wheelbarrow worth of meat and then took it outside the market. In the next scene, it shows him talking to two men who were telling him how to prepare monkey meat. The men told him that they were very hungry, and they were hungry enough to just eat the dried meat as it was without rehydrating it first. Larson gave the men some monkey meat, and they pulled it apart to share it. As they pulled it apart, Larson jumped away from the men, proclaiming, "Can you not splatter monkey all over me, please?" The men continued to work on getting the dried meat pulled into two pieces. As the men were finally able to get the meat apart, Larson exclaimed, "Oh my God, I'm getting bleeping pegged with Ebola monkey right now." Larson expressed his disgust and revulsion as the men continued to eat. Larson's interaction with these men typified his continued interaction with the librarians he interviewed throughout the piece. This type of framing occurred throughout the 2014 Ebola epidemic. In this presentation, I look at the power dynamics at work at a large-scale medical disaster. The power dynamics at work are those to create the narrative around the disaster. So I'm gonna, hopefully my look will be good as earlier, and I can play a little bit of this piece. Nope. But you can see here, this is the men that it was a thigh joint, I believe it was, so it's a dried meat, it's really difficult to pull apart. So it's just we just get a still instead of getting played in the video, so I apologize for that. So the two research questions that I have for this chapter, or for this presentation, is how do professionals frame epidemics for global, international, and local audiences? Research question 2 is, to what extent does the media mediate a disease's risk factors between the experts and the public? To answer these questions in this presentation, I'll briefly review the literature in medical rhetoric that pulls from narrative medicine and medical anthropology. I also pull from post-colonial and decolonial research theories for this presentation because it is essential to understand how those histories and cultures that form from the history of colonialism still impact so many facets of the previous colonized countries. This presentation adds a new layer to the field of international technical communication where it intersects with medical rhetoric. This presentation essentially adds a new layer to decolonial and international technical community theories, which is the relationship between power and those in a position to respond to the crisis, specifically a medical crisis. The intersection of power and narrative is not unique to this case study, but I choose to focus on bushmeat warnings from the 2014 Ebola epidemic for two reasons. First, framing of a disease is something that other researchers have focused on in the past. But when the Ebola outbreak struck West Africa, many of the same responses were evident, that were used in the past. So think of the ways in which HIV/AIDS and Africa has been described over the past 30 years. Second, the ways that the international news media covered the bushmeat warnings were in stark contrast to the local media coverage. And this provides a foundation for further examination of the power structures at work during large-scale international disasters. In this case, the international news media came into West African countries where the epidemic occurred and reported on the practice of hunting and consuming bushmeat with relatively little context. I decided to focus on the warnings against bushmeat and the way those warnings were reported on in the media broadly, because the reporting of those warnings became illustrative of how the reported narrative of the disease changed the overall context in which the epidemic was unfolding. Here's some key text that I pulled from. Sorry that it's a little bit small. Post-colonial and decolonial theories interrogate the culture created through the process of colonization. Post-colonial and decolonial theories are utilized throughout many different disciplines in the humanities. In Decolonizing the Mind, Diongo argues that a writer's handling of reality is affected by his basic philosophic outlook on nature and society. A writer's handling of the material can also be affected by his material base in society, that is, his class and position and standpoint. The author then draws on their individual history and culture through this positionality which supersedes the specific context from which the author is writing. So the vice reporter bringing with him all of his privilege from being a white male from the US, and then reported that from that position from Liberia. The positioning by the authors remains unchanged if the writer does not interrogate how their specific worldview was created. This presentation's argument rests on the argument that even if an individual is not acting as an agent of a foreign government to claim territory or land for an empire, they can still act in the mode of the colonizer by telling the story from the colonizer's perspective. Thus, when a story is framed through the colonizer's worldview, then the story becomes encoded with their histories and belief systems, rather than telling the story from the local perspective. In post-colonial studies, Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin argue that language becomes the medium through which hierarchical structures of power is perpetuated, and the medium through which conceptions of truth, order, and reality become established. An author's word choice in particular context exposes how both the author views the reality around them and how they believe their audience views their world as well. Therefore, the decision for Vice News to focus a piece on monkey meat specifically, as opposed to bushmeat more broadly, reveals how the reporter views West Africa. Furthermore, it reveals what he felt would appeal to the audience viewing the piece from Liberia. Not Liberians, but the people who were then viewing the piece about Liberia. Even though the term bushmeat refers to forest-dwelling animals or non-traditional game meat, the Vice reporter decided to specifically focus on monkey meat throughout the 20-minute piece on the Ebola outbreak in Liberia. Additionally, this seems to harken back to the days when Africa was written about as the Dark Continent. Additionally, in previously colonized spaces, people are still in a position, as we've talked about in other presentations today, to having to declare their own humanity. And it is always in juxtaposition to the colonizer. In decolonizing methodologies, the authors point out that there is a deep understanding of what it meant to not be considered fully human. In other words, to be considered savage. This framing of indigenous people, and in the case of this presentation, indigenous tradition as savage, leads to the narrative of blame where savage traditions brought on a savage disease. Researchers in technical and professional communication who are interested in studying communication or events that happen in previously colonized spaces need to be cognizant of how the medical community helped to create the colonizing system. Specifically, Smith writes to quote, "The ways in which scientific research is implicated in the world excesses of colonialism remains a powerful, remembered history in many of the world's colonized peoples. It is a history that still offends the deepest sense of our humanity." End quote. The medicalization of colonial systems of classification to determine the mental capacity of local populations is just to name one of the egregious connections between medicine and colonization. Trifler's work, How to Have Theory in an Epidemic, which is, I just realized when I was putting this presentation together that it's a 20-year-old book now, connects directly to how preconceived ideas by the media impacted and shaped the story of HIV/AIDS in Africa. She states that third world epidemics are seen to be simple material disasters. Given this narrative, it is easier to understand how the images generated by non-African sources of sick and dying patients in Africa are generally shown with a lack of medical care, an absent doctor, no medical equipment around, even what most people would imagine is a hospital. However, sources that originate from within Africa show scientists and technology in operation to fight the disease. The internationalized version of the epidemic is continually contextualized for Western audiences and presented as a monolith of helpless victims who die with little to no care. Other colonial narratives that played out as Western aid groups and Western media covered the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa, with the media utilizing narratives of Africa and other exotic cultures. This type of coverage was also part of the narrative during the Ebola epidemic. The stories mounted about people refusing to give up eating monkey meat in spite of the World Health Organization's warnings against the practice. Tricolor states that, quote, "A crisis serves as a point of articulation for multiple voices and interests, and communicators, technical communicators, crisis and emergency risk communicators need to understand that the voices of the global South are no different during a crisis." So for this study, I decided to look at newspaper articles that were produced for, like I said, local, international, and global audiences. And the way that I determined what would fall into each category is a local newspaper was one from which the outbreak was originating. In this case, I had access to newspapers from Liberia. International newspapers then were newspapers that were just across the border, right? So Ghana and Nigeria, I had access to those papers. And so those are international. Global is where you have the US and the UK news media is then produced for a local audience, but then it's also consumed internationally as more of a global audience. So I was able to search within the documents. I looked for just Ebola articles and then specifically searched for bushmeat, so articles that talked about both things. I looked for the Ebola epidemics first started or was announced March 23rd, 2014, and then July 23rd, 2014. So I did a 4-month period. The WHO did not declare the Ebola outbreak to become an epidemic until August 8, 2014. And so I wanted to capture that time period before it was declared an epidemic, because the Vice News piece that I mentioned was produced and published on YouTube in June 2014. So these articles then, I was able to see what was the context around which this other video was produced and was published. So is this just a one-off video, or is this something that's more of the media is participating sort of in this context? So the articles that were published in Liberia, Ghana, and Nigeria offered a more nuanced discussion about bushmeat. Each one of these countries actually has a history and a cultural practice of eating meat that is classified as bushmeat. And I'll make a footnote here that I would also argue that the term bushmeat should be decolonized. If I have a Southern Living cookbook at home and there's recipes in there for squirrel, which if I was in Ghana or Liberia, that would be considered bushmeat, but we just call it wild game here. So I think that that term should be interrogated as well, but that is not something that I'm undertaking in this project. When bushmeat was discussed in these articles from these 3 countries, there was an acknowledgement of bushmeat being a practice and not just something eaten by a few people. But there was discussion in the articles. There's discussion in the articles about the impact of the bushmeat trade on the hunters, markets, and the economy more broadly. Whereas the articles from the UK and the US simply stated that there is a ban on consumption or selling of bushmeat without acknowledging a broader impact that these bans had on local economies. Furthermore, the articles from Liberia, Ghana, and Nigeria had more attribution for the bushmeat warnings, meaning that these warnings were directly attributed to a government or public health official. Not all of the attributions in these articles were direct quotes, even though many are. Some attributions simply name the ministry as the source of the bushmeat ban. The articles published in Africa or for an African audience also provide more reasoning as to why the bushmeat ban is in place. For example, there's an article about tobacco regulations in Nigerian health minister, and while the reporter had him in front of, was able to interview the Nigerian health minister, he also asked about Ebola. He talked about what the Nigerian government was doing to promote public health awareness regarding Ebola. He mentioned concerns about animal-to-human transmission of Lassa fever and Ebola. He stated, quote, "We know what spreads infection for Lassa as a special type of rat in Nigeria. The ones for Ebola are bats that even some Nigerians see as bushmeat. And the bats eat fruits as well as sometimes you go and pluck the fruits that they have contaminated, and with the virus you can get infected." From this statement, the Nigerian Minister of Health did not create a narrative of blame for the people who do eat bats, but rather simply stated this is how transmission can happen even without consuming bat as meat. Articles from the US represented bushmeats as completely foreign concept. The bylines from the articles state that most of these pieces were written about from reporters located within the country that was dealing with an Ebola epidemic. However, the audience for these pieces were global in nature and not necessarily reading the news from a place that had familiarity with the history or cultural practices of eating bushmeat in West Africa. The ideas of local, global, and international are not ideas that are easily separated into neat categories. Newspapers in Liberia dealt with the local issues of the Ebola epidemic spreading through the country and the local issue and historical cultural practice of eating and consuming bushmeat. The articles from Nigeria were dealing with both of these issues from a localized lens as well. Even if the spread of Ebola in Nigeria was contained, public health officials there and around the world knew how close Nigeria came to a public disaster. Ghana dealt with the issues surrounding bushmeat and the bushmeat trade is a local issue because there is a cultural and historical practice of people hunting and consuming bushmeat in Ghana. However, the broader conversation around Ebola was one of international proportions because Ghanaian articles referenced the possibility of Ebola crossing borders and infecting the Ghanaian people. Articles from the UK and the US dealt with issues of Ebola and bushmeat as international issues because neither country has a history or cultural practice of eating and consuming meat called bushmeat. Therefore, the articles from these countries also use bushmeat as in the possibility of illegal meat smuggled into the country as means for Ebola to infect people within those borders in those countries. So with every research, you always have the so what, right? So why am I studying this? So the ramifications. So ramifications within West Africa the warnings were met with suspicion because information did not match with the lived experiences of West Africans. If you were to watch the whole video, the Vice video, there were people that were being interviewed and they did not believe that Ebola was in Liberia because they were connecting the warnings about bushmeat so heavily to the transmission of the virus that this didn't match their lived experience. They've been eating bushmeat all of their lives and they haven't had Ebola, so therefore this doesn't exist. Rumors and misinformation then filled the information gap. The Ebola epidemic narrative included a layer of shame and blame. The additional fuel of the idea of smuggled meat in the UK and the US articles can fuel xenophobic response. And it also sensationalized the coverage of the epidemic. So conclusion, local knowledges should be privileged to create health messages that generate belief and trust between communicators and the at-risk population. Medical care doesn't scale up fast enough, But behavioral change can. Communication is essential during epidemics,